I woke up on the floor of the observation bay, with my cheek pressed against cold steel, and the glass above me shimmering like something was breathing behind it. And that was the moment I realized I had broken one of the 11 rules they told me would keep me alive down here. I didn't even know I was asleep, and that's the part that still scares me. We all follow those rules because the lab sits deeper than anything built by human hands, and things move differently in the dark. I remember the first time I ignored one of them, the one about staying where you wake up. Something else was already standing there. I didn't know how dangerous it was to break Rule 1. Never move until you understand where you woke up until the morning. I opened my eyes and realized the room surrounding me wasn't the same one I had fallen asleep in. My first instinct was to get up fast, but something inside me froze when I noticed the change in temperature, like the air had been chilled by something silently watching from above. The observation bay lights were dimmer than usual, flickering in a pale blue that looked almost sick. My cheek was pressed against steel that felt wetter than it should have been, as if condensation had formed only around my skin. And the strangest part was that the door behind me, one I never used, was cracked open by just an inch. For several seconds, I remained exactly where I was, telling myself this had to be some kind of mistake, maybe a shift rotation I forgot, or a night walk I didn't remember. But the more I replayed the night in my head, the more I realized I had gone to bed in my own bunk, not in the observation bay, and nothing, absolutely nothing, should have moved me without waking me first. A thick uneasiness crawled up my spine as I studied the shadows in the corners, noticing details that didn't match the layout I knew. A supply crate sat near the wall, but it didn't belong to this section. The vents hummed at an unfamiliar rhythm, lower and slower, as if the system was compensating for something beneath the station. And the large observation window, usually clear, now looked fogged from the outside. I pushed myself slightly upward, still careful not to stand, because something in my mind whispered that moving too soon was a mistake. The room felt stretched somehow, like the proportions were off by a few inches in places I couldn't immediately identify. Maybe pressure shifts warped the structure, or maybe my half-awake brain was distorting details, but the effect made the entire room feel subtly wrong. I tried to steady my breathing, noticing how the metal floor vibrated under me, not from machinery, but from something slow and heavy moving far below the station. The deep sea always had a pulse, but this felt too rhythmic, as if responding to mine. And that open door behind me kept drawing my attention, like something had slipped through it while I slept. When I slowly sat up, the fogged observation window caught my eye again. The condensation created long vertical streaks, but they weren't shaped like water runoff. They were too straight, too even, almost parallel, like the window had been touched by wide, flattened fingers. I blinked hard, telling myself I was imagining it, yet the pattern didn't change. If anything, more streaks formed the longer I stared at them, as if whatever caused them had been watching me long before I woke. A low throb passed through the room, shaking the window ever so slightly, and the streaks quivered like they were fresh. A part of me wanted to crawl toward the glass and inspect it, but a louder part whispered not to. That open door was the bigger problem, and I needed to understand why it was open at all. I turned my head slowly toward it, studying the sliver of darkness beyond the frame. The hall lights outside were off, something that never happened unless maintenance was scheduled, but there had been no schedule last night, and even if there had, no one would have come into the observation bay and left the door half open. I realized then that the silence outside was deeper than usual, like the hallway was filled with thick water instead of air. The pressure monitors on the wall blinked steadily, all stable, yet the atmosphere felt wrong in a way no monitor could explain. The open door looked like an invitation, or a warning, depending on how you saw it, and each second that passed made it feel more like something was waiting for me to step through. I forced myself to look around more carefully, keeping still, remembering the stories the older researchers told when they were drunk enough to forget protocol. Stories about people who woke up in the wrong rooms, people who swore the station shifted in the night, people who heard slow footsteps behind them when they knew the corridors were empty. Most of us laughed those tales off, blaming stress and sleep deprivation. But now, lying in a room I hadn't chosen to sleep in, with the door ajar and the window streaked by something that shouldn't be able to touch it, those stories felt less like jokes and more like warnings we ignored. My throat tightened as I realized I wasn't sure I was alone in the room. The vibration beneath me grew slightly stronger, steadying into a rhythmic pulse that matched the dim flicker of the overhead lights. Sometimes the station pulsed when the geothermal vents below shifted, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. I swallowed hard, listening. The pulse slowed, as if something large had settled into place below us, and the air in the bay thickened. My fingers brushed the floor, feeling the cold metal, grounding myself as I took in the smallest details. The misplaced crate, the fogged window, the cold steel, the open door, all of it pointed to the same unsettling conclusion. I hadn't walked here. Something had brought me. I needed to stand eventually, but standing without understanding was exactly what the rule warned against. So I stayed still a little longer, letting my eyes adjust as I scanned every corner again. A shadow near the vent looked wrong, not in shape, but in the fact that it didn't line up with the angle of the lights. I stared at it, barely breathing. For a moment, I thought I saw it shift, but then the lights flickered again, and it settled back into place. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I realized the shadow wasn't shaped like any equipment I recognized. It was too tall, too thin, and it curved inward near the top like something tilting its head. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that it wasn't an object at all. It was a figure. A tall, motionless figure standing near the vent, facing me. My breath caught in my throat, and the cold metal beneath me seemed to grow colder as the realization washed over me. If I had stood the moment I woke up, I would have walked directly toward it without noticing. That open door might have been a distraction, pulling my focus away from the thing already inside the room. My limbs tensed, every instinct screaming to run, but the rule echoed louder in my thoughts, anchoring me in place. I stayed still, completely still, and that was when the figure slowly leaned away from the light, disappearing into the deeper shadow by the wall. It didn't walk or step, it simply shifted its weight, as though its body flowed backward into the darkness. The pulse beneath the floor aligned perfectly with its movement, like the station itself reacted to it. The lights dimmed further, and for a brief moment, the observation window behind me cleared just enough to reflect the room. When I glanced at the reflection, I saw something standing behind me, close enough that its outline blurred with mine. My breath stalled as the reflection shimmered, showing a faint shape towering over me, its head bending slowly as though studying the back of my neck. The air around me grew colder, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. I didn't move. I couldn't. That was the rule, and breaking it felt like stepping directly into whatever waited behind me. The reflection trembled, the shape leaning closer, and as the lights flickered again, its outline sharpened just enough for me to see the curve of its shoulders bending in an unnatural downward slope. I clutched the floor, unable to speak, unable to breathe freely, waiting for it to touch me. But instead of reaching toward me, the reflection twitched, then vanished entirely, as if whatever stood behind me had dissolved into the air. The pulse beneath the station faded with it. The fog on the observation window thickened again, and the open door behind me creaked a little wider, as though silently inviting me to come see what waited outside. My chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths as I realized I had no idea if the thing had left the room or simply hid somewhere I couldn't see. A soft, shifting weight pressed subtly against the floor, far too close for comfort, and the lights flickered one more time. I exhaled shakily, realizing the air tasted slightly metallic now, as if something had passed right through me, leaving the scent of deep ocean pressure behind. The room felt wrong in every direction, and the open door was beginning to look like the only path left. I swallowed, trying to gather courage, even though I wasn't sure stepping through it would lead somewhere safer. And then I saw it, a faint outline moving across the fogged window from the outside, slow and deliberate, trailing long parallel marks behind it. The streaks lined up perfectly with the ones above my sleeping position. Whatever touched that glass had been there before I woke up, and now it was returning. I forced myself to rise just slightly, knees still on the floor, breath trembling as the shadow outside pressed closer to the window. My heart pounded as the shape grew clearer, though never fully visible, like something enormous drifting behind a veil. I needed to leave the observation bay, but moving too early could draw its attention again. Before I could decide, the lights above me dimmed to their lowest point yet, and the marks on the glass began to lengthen, as something traced them downward, slowly, deliberately, as if waiting for me to choose my next move. That's when I realized the shadow by the vent was gone, and something else had entered the room. I didn't understand why Rule 2. Never look directly at the observation window. After 3 o'clock was drilled into us from the moment we were flown out to the platform. Even during training, Commander Hale made us repeat it aloud like a prayer. I used to laugh with the others. After all, what difference could a specific hour make? We were scientists, not superstitious sailors afraid of sea folklore. But the deeper I stayed in Lab 9, the more something in me began to shift. Something instinctive and primal, as if a part of my brain older than language recognized a predator. And now, after 5 months in the dark pressure beneath the world, I no longer laugh at anything, least of all the window. The observation window sits at the far end of the habitat, an oval panel of hardened glass facing the endless black. During the day cycle, it looks harmless, almost peaceful, a slow ballet of drifting plankton, the faint glow of bioluminescent algae, the occasional glittering trail of a passing eel. But after 3 o'clock, our sensors shift, the currents change, and the ocean outside becomes something else entirely. I used to think it was the pressure, or the rotating darkness playing tricks on tired minds. But the first time I broke the rule, I learned it wasn't in my head. It was my second month, the night we lost Dr. Torres. We'd finished a 12-hour sequence of genetic sampling from the Trench Ridge, and were finally settling into rest, when the alarms crackled. Not the red emergency lights, just the soft ping of a pressure fluctuation. Torres volunteered to run diagnostics. It was 2:47 when he left the dorm tunnel. I heard his boots on the graded walkway. I heard the hiss of the automated doors. I assumed he'd be back in 2 minutes. He wasn't. At 3:01, the motion sensors picked up movement by the observation deck. Torres had no reason to be there. When I checked the live feed, all I could see was his silhouette, standing completely still, facing the window. The camera's frame rate stuttered, the way it does when something enormous moves into the water around us. I radioed him. No response. I zoomed the feed. That was the moment the lights flickered, just once, but enough to show me something behind the glass, something pale, a patch of white, a curve like a face pressed against the window. But the scale was wrong. It was too big, too smooth, too still. When the light steadied, the pale shape was gone, and so was Torres. We sealed the deck, ran a full sweep, even activated the rail-mounted drones outside the habitat. Nothing. No breach, no body, nothing at all except the faint echo of disturbed silt. Officially, the report said voluntary exit through the maintenance hatch, but we all knew that was impossible. No one could reach it without triggering alarms. And even if he had, no one opens a hatch 7,000 meters down, not unless something is telling them to. After that night, the rule made sense in a way I wish it didn't. But the worst part wasn't Torres vanishing. It was what happened 4 nights later, when I broke the rule myself. The lab's insomnia had been worsening. Something about this depth, this isolation, this impossible pressure, it changes your circadian rhythms. You start waking up at 3 o'clock with a pounding heart for no reason. That night, I was sitting alone in the brake module, clutching a mug of lukewarm coffee, too wired to sleep. One flicker from the ceiling lights caught my eye, then another, then a third, and then something tapped the window. Just once, like a knuckle on glass. I froze. My breath caught. I tried to convince myself it was just thermal contraction or sediment movement. But the tap came again. 2 sharp raps, deliberate, impatient. I shouldn't have stood up. I shouldn't have listened to the voice in my head, whispering maybe it's a diver, maybe someone needs help, but exhaustion makes you stupid. I walked toward the corridor, and the closer I got to the observation deck, the colder the air felt. Condensation curled along the metal walls. The lights buzzed like insects caught between glass. When I reached the deck entrance, the door was slightly open. I swear I didn't open it. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. The room was lit only by the faint emergency strips along the floor. Every instinct told me not to look at the window. Every lecture from Commander Hale, every warning in the manual, every disappearance we'd never spoken of aloud, all of it screamed through my skull. But something else was there too. A pressure in the room, a weight, like a presence standing beside me, and then another tap, this one from inside my head. Not on the glass, a vibration behind my eyes, like a wordless urge. Look. I clenched my jaw. My heartbeat pounded so hard it hurt. The air smelled metallic, like blood and water. I told myself I'd just glance, just for a second, just to prove there was nothing there. I looked. The darkness outside was complete, the kind that swallows light instead of reflecting it. But then slowly, 2 shapes drifted toward the window. Circular, pale, not eyes exactly, but the suggestion of eyes, the size of dinner plates, the size of helmets, the size of something that evolved where sunlight never touched. They drifted closer and closer, and then inches from the glass, they smiled. Not a mouth, not lips, just a widening curve, a distortion, a shift in the shape of the face itself, like a membrane stretching into an expression meant only to mimic something human. I stumbled backward, my spine hit the metal rail, my breath failed, the smile widened, then something reached up, some limb, some shadow, and brushed the window from the outside. Not knocking, stroking, testing. The glass groaned. I ran. I don't remember leaving the deck. I don't remember slamming the door. I don't remember diving into my bunk. I only remember waking up hours later, soaked in sweat, and hearing Commander Hale whispering to someone in the hall. He looked. He shouldn't have looked. Since that night, something has been following me inside the lab. I don't hear footsteps. I don't see shadows. It's subtler than that. It's the sense of someone standing just behind me when I brush my teeth. It's the way the lights dim when I pass certain corners. It's the way I wake up at 3 o'clock every single night now. And the worst part, I hear tapping. Not on the window anymore. Inside my room's wall. 3 taps. Always 3. Like it's waiting for me to open the door. Like it remembers the moment I broke the rule. Like it wants me to look again. I used to think Rule 3, never speak to anyone through the intercom, after you've confirmed they're asleep, was nothing more than a psychological safeguard. Down here, at the bottom of the world, your mind starts inventing voices. The ocean makes you hear things. Groans in the pipework, distant tremors that echo like words, pressure shifts that mimic whispers. So the rule made sense in a basic way. Don't trust a voice calling your name at 4 o'clock. But the first night I heard someone speak to me through the intercom, someone I had personally tucked into their sleeping pod, I realized the rule existed for something far worse than hallucinations. The intercom system in Lab 9 is older than any of the current crew. It runs on a direct wire circuit along the habitat's spine, bypassing the main network so that even if power fails, we can still communicate within the modules. But its age shows. It hums with static. It crackles with distortion. Sometimes it even picks up low-frequency sounds from the trench. Groans, rumbles, vibrations from creatures that dwarf our research drones. At first you get used to the noise. Eventually your brain filters it like background ocean. But not the voices. Never the voices. The first time it happened, we were 5 weeks into our shift. Sleep deprivation was already hitting us hard. The deeper the lab sits, the more your circadian rhythm collapses. Nights feel endless. Dreams become vivid and strange. And that night, I couldn't sleep at all. Torres had disappeared 2 weeks earlier. Hale had tightened all schedules. Mandatory sleep cycles. Mandatory mental health logs. Mandatory auditory checks. We were supposed to be more careful than ever. More alert. Ironically, that's what made me slip. It was 3:27 when the intercom at my bedside crackled quietly. I lifted my head, annoyed, thinking it was Hale doing another round of checks. Instead, a soft, trembling whisper slipped through the speaker. "Hey, you awake?" It was Rowan, our medic. She had been asleep. I was sure of it. I'd checked on her earlier. After Torres vanished, she wanted someone to stay close during sleep hours. So I'd walked her to her pod, sealed it, and watched her breathing slow. She was not awake at 3 o'clock. I sat up. "Rowan?" I said cautiously. "You okay?" A long pause. "Then it's so dark in here. Come get me, please." Her voice sounded strained, breathless, like she was crying quietly, but trying to hide it. Something inside me tensed. Rowan wasn't the type to panic. If she was whispering like this through a direct intercom, something had to be seriously wrong. I swung my legs out of bed and grabbed my boots. "What happened?" I asked. Another silence. Then I can't move my arms. My heart thudded. Sleep paralysis. A medical emergency. Maybe she'd fainted in her pod. No, she had been fine when I'd left her. I pulled on my jacket and stepped into the dim hallway. Condensation curled on the walls again. The air felt heavy, colder than usual. "Stay where you are," I said, jogging up the corridor. "I'm coming." I passed the atmospheric processing tanks, turned left into the docking wing. The lights flickered. Always the lights. The deeper we stayed, the more the lab felt like a living thing, breathing, pulsing, watching. I reached Rowan's pod. The door was closed. The status light was green. Inside, the thermal monitor blinked steadily. Heart rate calm, breathing slow, unmoving. Rowan was asleep, completely, peacefully, exactly where I'd left her. I stared through the small viewing window, waiting for some sign she was pretending. But no, her face was slack, her lips parted, her body limp in deep sleep. And yet the intercom on the wall crackled again. "I can't feel my legs now," the voice whispered right into my ear. I stepped back so fast I hit the opposite wall. My pulse hammered. I looked from the intercom to the sleeping Rowan, then back again. She was asleep, but something pretending to be her was speaking to me. My hands trembled as I reached for the manual override on the pod door. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Some parasite, a hallucination. Maybe Rowan was awake, and the monitors were glitching. But as soon as my fingers touched the panel, the intercom whispered, "Don't open it. It's right behind you." I froze. Every hair on my body rose. The hallway temperature dropped several degrees in seconds. My breath clouded in front of me. Something shifted in the dim corridor behind me. A weight in the air, a pressure change, like a large body moving to block the passage. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. "Rowan," I whispered again, my voice cracking. But the voice that answered wasn't hers anymore. This time, the whisper stretched, pulling each word thin. "You should have stayed in your room." The lights flickered violently. Something scraped the metal floor behind me. A long, dragging sound. My knees nearly buckled. I kept my back to whatever stood in the dark, and hit the emergency override on Rowan's pod. Sirens wailed. The pod door hissed open. Rowan jerked awake, coughing and startled. She sat up fast, eyes wide. "What the hell? Why are you screaming?" I wasn't screaming, but something down the hallway was. It was a distant sound, muffled by walls but unmistakable. A human scream distorted by water pressure, stretched into something not quite human anymore. Rowan grabbed my arm. "What's happening?" The intercom clicked again. "Don't turn around." We ran. We sprinted down the corridor so fast we nearly slipped on condensation. Whatever was in the hallway didn't chase us. Or maybe it did, silently, unseen. I didn't look, neither did Rowan. When we reached the central module, Hale was already there, gun drawn, eyes wild. He'd heard the screams too. When he saw our faces, he didn't even ask questions. He just said, "You spoke to it." He knew what it was. Later, after we locked down the entire dorm wing, Hale explained in the quietest voice I've ever heard him use. "Down here, you don't hear voices. You're heard. Something listens. Something imitates. Something wants to be let inside." I didn't sleep for 2 days. And Rowan refuses to use the intercom at all now, even during emergencies. She says if she hears her own voice whispering back to her again, she'll lose her mind. I believe her, because ever since that night, the intercom in my room crackles at 3 o'clock sharp, every single night. And last night, the voice didn't sound like Rowan. It sounded like me, asking myself to open the door. After what I experienced with the intercom, I thought I understood the rules. But then I learned Rule 4, never touch anything left unlabeled in the lab, was less about protocol and more about survival. It started with a small mistake, an unlabeled sample vial sitting on the counter near the genetic incubator. I rationalized that it must have been left out by the previous shift, or misplaced by one of the interns. Curiosity got the better of me. Just a quick glance. Just a moment to see what it contained. The moment my fingers grazed the smooth glass, I felt the air shift, thick and electric, like the lab itself was warning me to stop, but it was already too late. At first, nothing happened. I held the vial up to the dim light and saw a cloudy fluid, swirling faintly, reflecting bioluminescent streaks from the outside. A soft vibration ran through the floor, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me pull my hand back. I hesitated. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move in response to my breathing. I convinced myself it was a combination of stress, exhaustion, and the pressure of being 7 kilometers underwater. Still, there was a nagging thought lodged deep in my brain. Why would a sample be left unlabeled in a place where precision is everything? I tried to set it down, careful not to make a sound, but the vial resisted, slipping slightly from my grip as though something unseen guided its movement. It rolled once, twice, then stopped at the edge of the counter, teetering dangerously close to falling. My heart raced as I reached to steady it. That's when I noticed the condensation forming inside the glass wasn't just moisture. It was like the liquid itself was alive, swirling against gravity in odd patterns, small shapes forming and disappearing within. My hand froze. I remembered every lecture about contamination and pressure hazards, but none of it accounted for the slow, deliberate motion inside this one vial. Suddenly, the lights flickered and dimmed, and the shadows in the room deepened, pooling like ink at the edges of my vision. I blinked, and the shapes in the fluid appeared sharper, clearer, almost conscious. I realized, with a jolt of horror, that something inside was aware of me. It wasn't alive in the biological sense I was trained to recognize. It didn't breathe, didn't move like a creature. Yet, when I shifted my gaze, it seemed to respond, mirroring my motions as if mocking me. I stumbled back, knocking over a small stack of Petri dishes. They clattered, echoing in the hollow metal lab, and then everything went silent. That silence was more oppressive than any noise could have been. I couldn't hear the ventilation hum, the faint pulse of the habitat, nothing, just the soft, viscous motion in the vial. My hand itched with the urge to throw it away, to get rid of it, but something stopped me. It wasn't a thought, not exactly. It was a command. primal and urgent, lodged somewhere beneath conscious reasoning. Do not drop it. My pulse accelerated, and a cold sweat spread across my back. I considered leaving the lab immediately, but I was frozen. The rules had never felt more important, and Rule 4 burned in my mind like a warning. Never touch anything left unlabeled in the lab. I reached for the console beside the incubator, trying to initiate the containment protocol to seal the sample in the automated chamber, but the screen froze. Numbers flickered, sensors blinked erratically, and then the main lights dimmed to emergency red. Shadows in the corners deepened further, curling along the floor like liquid smoke. My instincts screamed to leave, but my curiosity, my scientific mind, kept me rooted. The shapes in the vial had shifted, forming a vague outline, almost humanoid, bending and stretching within the glass. My stomach churned. I realized I wasn't dealing with a mistake, a misplaced sample, or a laboratory oversight. I was interacting with something else entirely. Something in the room watched me, not with eyes, but with presence. Every step I considered taking caused the air around me to thicken. I felt like I was being pressed down by invisible hands, held in place, forced to confront what I had done. The vial shivered in my grip, though no external movement could account for it. And then, without warning, the shadows along the walls stretched toward me, elongating unnaturally, licking the edges of my vision. The metal floor beneath me seemed to pulse in response, syncing with the erratic vibrations inside the vial. I realized I had no control, that the rule I had brushed off in training wasn't bureaucratic. It was a line I was never supposed to cross. I stumbled backward, trying to place the vial back on the counter, but it wasn't static. It rolled back toward me, almost as if the room itself refused to let me set it down. My mind raced, panic clawed at me, but the voice of Commander Hale echoed in my memory, warning about every deviation in protocol. Every mistake under this deep-sea lab's roof was magnified, made catastrophic by isolation and pressure. I swallowed hard. The vial quivered again, and I felt a shiver travel from my fingertips through my entire body. Then the faintest whisper reached my ears, so soft I thought I was imagining it. "Why did you touch me?" I spun around, heart hammering, but the lab was empty. Only the shadows moved, stretching and shrinking as though breathing. My eyes returned to the vial, which now seemed to float slightly above the counter, defying physics. Shapes inside it moved faster, coalescing into figures too tall and slender to be human, bending and twisting in ways that made my stomach lurch. I gritted my teeth and stepped forward, gripping the vial, as if I could force it back to its place. The shapes inside recoiled, the motion rippling through the liquid like waves, and then for a moment, everything froze. The shadows stopped, the room held its breath, and the air felt heavier than it ever had. I realized I had only seconds to act. If I didn't place it back, if I didn't follow the rule, whatever was in the vial might spread, might follow me, might escape the boundaries of the glass. My hands shook violently, the light flickered again, and I thought I saw a figure in the reflection of the glass, behind me, taller than any person in the crew. I turned quickly. Nothing. Only the lab, only the equipment, only the shadows that still shifted subtly in response to me. I forced my fingers to steady the vial and push it toward the chamber. The shadows reacted instantly, stretching and warping toward me again. It was aware, it was waiting. Finally, I managed to place the vial onto the containment tray. The magnetic locks engaged automatically, and the liquid settled. The figures inside dissolved into indistinct swirls. The shadows retreated slightly, but the room didn't return to normal. The pulse beneath the floor lingered, faint but persistent, and my hands continued to shake. I exhaled shakily, realizing how close I had come to crossing a boundary that wasn't just about rules. It was about surviving the depths. That vial, unlabeled and forgotten, had been a test, and I had nearly failed. I backed out of the lab slowly, glancing at the containment chamber, until the red lights of the emergency strip reflected softly, on the glass. Every instinct screamed to leave, to avoid touching anything else, to adhere to Rule 4 in every possible circumstance. The shadows still shifted subtly behind the instruments, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like an echo of what had been inside the vial. My legs felt weak. My mind refused to stop replaying the scene, imagining the shapes in the liquid, forming something even larger, something waiting for me in the dark corners beyond the glass. As I reached the doorway, a sudden pressure shift hit my chest, as if the room itself inhaled sharply. The vial inside the chamber vibrated slightly, a subtle reminder that the rule was not just about avoiding objects. It was about understanding that some things are never meant to be handled by human hands. I staggered down the corridor, unsure if my pulse or the vibrations in the lab were dictating my pace. Every reflective surface, every window, every monitor seemed to twitch with awareness, reminding me that the rule existed for a reason. One false move, one curious touch, and I might not have survived the night. By the time I reached my bunk, sweat soaked my shirt, my breathing was ragged, and the shadow of what I had almost unleashed lingered in my mind. I knew that if I ever broke Rule 4 again, it would not be just a test, it would be a sentence. I climbed into bed, staring at the ceiling panels, hearing the faintest hum from the containment tray down the hall, feeling the weight of the abyss pressing in from every direction. I had survived this time, barely, and I understood, more deeply than ever, that Rule 4, never touch anything left unlabeled in the lab, was not just a guideline, it was a lifeline. One wrong step, and I would be swallowed by the depths, by the things that existed beyond human understanding, waiting to punish curiosity. After everything I had survived so far, I thought I understood the boundaries of danger in Lab 9. But Rule 5, never enter the maintenance shafts alone, was a lesson I would soon learn the hard way. The shafts were narrow, twisting tunnels running like veins beneath the lab, carrying power conduits, air circulation ducts, and piping that kept the habitat alive. Most of the crew avoided them, except for scheduled checks, and even then, never alone. But that night, after hearing subtle vibrations through the floors and walls, curiosity gnawed at me again. Something was wrong with the oxygen filtration system on the east side, and no one else was awake. I told myself it would be fine. Just a quick inspection, just enough to check the readings. But the moment I slid open the small maintenance hatch and stepped inside, I felt the air grow heavier, as if the shaft itself was aware of my presence. The metal walls closed in on either side, wet and slick with condensation. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness ahead, and every inch I advanced seemed to amplify the echoes of my own movements. The sound of dripping water, the slow hum of the main lines, everything felt alive, as though the lab's innards were shifting and breathing in response to my steps. I remembered the rule, the precise warning from Commander Hale drilled into us all: never enter the maintenance shafts alone. My lips moved the words silently, as I reminded myself why it existed, but repeating it did little to calm the tight knot in my stomach. The corridor stretched before me like an endless tunnel, twisting and narrowing, forcing me to crouch in places where the ceiling dipped dangerously low. The faint vibration beneath my boots felt different this time, deliberate, rhythmic, like something was pacing alongside me. I pressed forward, flashlight sweeping over cables bundled and clamped with industrial precision. The shadows along the walls seemed to move against the light, stretching unnaturally in ways that defied geometry. I shook my head, telling myself it was my imagination, exhaustion, or the low oxygen levels affecting my perception. But as I moved deeper, I noticed faint markings on the walls, scratches or gouges that weren't part of the maintenance design. They appeared sporadic at first, then more frequent, closer together, almost like they were counting my steps, waiting for me to reach a certain point. A metallic tang filled the air, subtle at first, then stronger, hinting at something that had been there before me, or worse, something still present in the shadows. The further I ventured, the more I noticed the temperature dropping, the air feeling viscous, clinging to my skin. I forced myself to remember why the rule existed. It wasn't just about avoiding claustrophobia or accidental injury. There was something else down here, something that became more aware when you were alone, something that could move through the confined spaces faster than any human could react. The shadows began to stretch toward me, elongating, as though the walls themselves were bending. My flashlight flickered, then steadied, revealing a faint silhouette at the bend ahead. I froze. It wasn't moving yet, but I could feel it watching, every motion of mine amplified in the confined corridor. I considered retreating, but my curiosity, or perhaps foolish bravery, pushed me forward. The shaft narrowed, forcing me to crouch low, my boots slipping slightly on the wet metal floor. The figure, or whatever it was, moved slightly as I approached, but I could not see it clearly. It didn't have a shape I could identify. It was a dark mass, absorbing light, pulsating in sync with the vibrations I felt through the floor. I could hear the faint hiss of the ventilation lines above, but it was distorted, like the air itself was bending around the figure, carrying its presence toward me. My heartbeat hammered in my ears. I realized that if I had not followed Rule 5, if I had not heeded the warning to avoid the shafts alone, I might already be lost to it. A sudden noise made me jump, a soft scraping sound echoing from deeper in the tunnel. My flashlight swung instinctively toward it, revealing nothing. Just the narrow corridor stretching ahead, dark and oppressive, but the sensation of being watched intensified. My skin prickled, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. I reminded myself of the rule, repeating the words silently in my mind. Never enter the maintenance shafts alone. I knew the rule wasn't just precautionary, it was survival, and now I understood why. Whatever was in this shaft could isolate you, manipulate perception, and draw you deeper into the labyrinth of metal veins where no one could help you. My pulse spiked, and for the first time, I regretted stepping inside. I forced myself to continue toward the source of the oxygen alarm, my hands gripping the wet conduit pipes along the wall. Every step felt slower, every movement magnified. The vibrations beneath my feet shifted, like footsteps pacing alongside me, echoing too perfectly for them to be my own. Shadows writhed along the walls, coalescing into forms that bent and stretched unnaturally. I began to hear faint whispers, incoherent at first, rising in clarity, repeating words I didn't recognize, sounding almost human yet impossibly wrong. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed onward, flashlight shaking in my grip. Each bend of the shaft revealed more shadows, more elongated shapes that seemed to anticipate my movement. I finally reached the junction, where the oxygen sensors flickered. The panel displayed normal readings, yet the low hum of the filters suggested something was wrong. My flashlight illuminated the area, and for a brief moment, I saw dozens of scratches etched into the metal walls, all converging toward the far end of the tunnel. And then I noticed the shadows shifting faster, reacting to me as if the mere presence of a living being violated the space. The whispers grew louder, almost forming words: leave, leave, leave. I backed up instinctively, but the shaft seemed to stretch endlessly, and the exit I had come through appeared further away than I remembered. My pulse raced, and the oppressive air seemed heavier, pressing down on my shoulders. A sudden metallic clang reverberated behind me. I froze, holding my flashlight in front of me. Nothing was visible, yet the sound echoed closer and closer. I could feel it, not footsteps, not human, not mechanical, but something massive moving silently in the confined corridor. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, flashlight shaking. The whispers had stopped. Now there was only the heavy pulse, the vibrating air, and the looming presence just beyond the reach of my light. I understood then that the rule was a shield, a boundary. Alone in the shaft, I was a target, and nothing here played by normal rules. I debated retreating, but fear had frozen my limbs. My flashlight flickered again, revealing a shape at the bend, taller than any human, darker than any shadow, moving smoothly toward me without making a sound. My fingers clenched the railing desperately. I reminded myself of the rule, the warning. the lives it had saved. Never enter the maintenance shafts alone. The truth of it became unbearable. I had brought this on myself. Every instinct screamed to run, yet the corridor seemed to warp, bending subtly, pushing me toward the figure. The air pressure shifted, heavy and cold, and I realized I was alone in a space designed to trap and confuse anyone who dared ignore the rule. Finally, a subtle vibration ran up the walls, like something brushing along the metal surfaces, approaching with deliberate intent. My flashlight flickered violently, casting long, impossibly angled shadows across the walls. I felt the presence beside me, a cold brush of air, almost tactile, moving in rhythm with the vibrations. I stumbled backward, colliding with a conduit, my breath rasping. My hands sought the emergency hatch latch, fumbling, desperate. The whispers returned, almost forming words distorted. Stay, stay, stay. I slammed the hatch, sealed it, and pressed my body against the steel, as the air seemed to pulse with the unseen entity's frustration. The shaft grew silent, the pressure returned to normal, and my limbs shook uncontrollably. I had survived, but I understood fully now why the rule existed. Rule 5 was no longer a guideline, it was a life or death law. Alone in the maintenance shafts, even the smallest misstep could draw attention from whatever lurked beneath the lab. I vowed never to enter that space alone again. And as I exited into the main corridor, the faint echo of footsteps behind the hatch reminded me that the thing inside was still aware, still waiting, still patient. The pulse beneath my boots lingered long after I left, a whisper of warning etched into the metal and my mind alike. After surviving the horrors of the maintenance shafts, I thought I had learned to respect every rule. Yet Rule 6, never leave the lab without logging your exact location, was one I would almost immediately forget in the haze of exhaustion. At first glance, the procedure seemed trivial, a bureaucratic hoop in a facility already riddled with risks. Every door, every corridor, every module in Lab 9 had sensors and cameras, yet Commander Hale insisted on manual logging. Down here, technology is unreliable, he'd said, voice grim. Your record of presence is the only thing keeping the abyss from claiming you. I'd nodded, weary from yet another sleepless night, convinced that a simple entry into the logbook was redundant. I was wrong. That night, I needed to collect samples from the outer biodome, an area that protruded like a small bubble into the trench's blackness. The airlock was narrow, the pressure differential critical, and my mind was fogged from 5 days of interrupted sleep cycles. I glanced at the logging station, and in my hurry decided I could enter my location later. I told myself it was fine. I'd done this 100 times, and the sensors would record my presence. The outer dome was only 20 meters from the lab, and the water outside the viewport was calm, dark, almost inviting. But as soon as I stepped out of the lab and onto the narrow catwalk toward the dome, I felt a subtle shift in the air, a pull, a tug at my awareness, like the abyss itself had taken notice. The catwalk creaked beneath my boots, wet from condensation, and a thin layer of salt brought in from the filtered sea currents. The pressure outside was always noticeable, a constant hum through my ears. But tonight, the hum was different, lower, slower, pulsing, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. I paused, scanning the dark expanse beneath the dome's glass. Shadows moved in the water, faint but deliberate, weaving patterns that did not resemble natural currents. I swallowed, trying to steady my heartbeat. The rule came back to me then, sharp and clear: never leave the lab without logging your exact location. But I was already too far. The logs were empty. The abyss was aware of my unsanctioned movement. I reached the sample tray at the end of the catwalk, illuminated only by the dome's faint bioluminescent glow. The vials shimmered with living organisms, slow, mesmerizing in their dance. I bent to collect one, but the lights flickered. A pressure shift hit my chest, subtle yet unmistakable. The water outside the dome seemed to darken further, thickening like ink, swallowing the faint glimmers of bioluminescence. A soft vibration ran through the catwalk, echoing through the metal floor into my boots. I tried to rationalize it, the habitat's outer hull expanding under pressure, a routine current anomaly, anything but the truth. But deep in my gut, I knew better. Rule 6 existed because without a record of presence, the abyss could reach in, unseen and unaccounted for. I straightened, trying to call back to the lab over the intercom, only to find it dead, static. My own voice echoed faintly before vanishing into silence. Panic bubbled under my ribs. The shadows in the water thickened, coalescing, forming shapes that were wrong, too smooth, too vast, stretching across the dome like they had no natural boundaries. One shape pressed against the glass, pale and massive, then recoiled. My eyes widened. It wasn't alone. Others swirled beyond, always just beyond focus, like predators waiting to see if I was noticed. I stumbled backward, clutching the sample tray, trying to retreat, but the catwalk seemed to lengthen, stretching my distance to the lab, the airlock now impossibly far. The rules warning screamed in my mind without logging. I had no record, no protection, no tether to the world above. I was alone, exposed, unmarked. The shadows in the water began moving in synchrony with my heartbeat. I could feel them, not just see them, pressing against the glass with intent. My hands shook violently as I reached for the dome hatch. The sample tray slipped from my grip, falling and rattling, the vials spinning like planets in microgravity before clattering into the containment tray. The motion drew the attention of something massive, a single, enormous form pressed flat against the outer glass, stretching impossibly, its pale surface pressing as if to mimic human shape. But its scale was grotesque, limbs elongated, curves exaggerated. I froze. It didn't have eyes. It didn't need them. It recognized presence. It recognized exposure, and I had not logged my location. I was visible. I was alone. I forced my legs to move, stepping backward, retreating along the catwalk, the weight of the abyss pressing from beneath the glass. The shadow loomed larger, spreading wider, flattening and stretching as if it wanted to merge with me through the barrier. My breath caught, the lights flickered, a low vibration thrummed through the metal, echoing from the depths. I tried the intercom again. Silence, only a whispering hiss, like air over glass, whispering words I could almost understand. Where? My pulse raced, my hands shook, my eyes burned from trying to focus. Every instinct screamed to run back, to re-enter the lab, to secure my position in the logs, but the catwalk felt endless. The abyss had noticed the breach. Then faintly, a mechanical sound, the slow rotation of the automated arm that maintained the airlock. It was supposed to be routine, a backup measure, a safety, but tonight, it sounded too slow, deliberate. I heard the hiss of hydraulics, and the door to the lab ahead moved just a fraction, as if the abyss itself was influencing the machinery. Shadows shifted again, writhing along the inner surface of the glass. I understood then, the abyss doesn't need to break the rules. The rules define it, mark it, allow it to act. Without the log, I was untethered, a ghost in the system, fully exposed to what existed beyond comprehension. I ran, my boots splashed along the wet catwalk, arms pumping, lungs burning. Behind me, the shadows swirled, forming larger, darker patterns, moving in tandem with my own frantic movements. The air in my helmet felt thick, pressing into my chest, pulling my attention into the dark, toward the unseen forms outside. The intercom crackled once, faintly, and I thought I heard my own voice, distorted, whispering, "Log it, log it." My fingers itched to reach the logging station, to mark my presence, to satisfy the rule that now felt like the only lifeline between survival and whatever waited in the black water. Finally, I slammed through the lab's airlock door, the hiss of pressure and the sudden warmth of familiar air hitting me like a wave. I staggered to the console, heart hammering, and frantically entered my exact location, logging each step I had taken. The shadows outside the dome withdrew almost immediately, as if they had been bound by my compliance. My hands trembled violently, my vision blurred, but I knew I had narrowly avoided being claimed. Rule 6, never leave the lab without logging your exact location, was not a bureaucratic formality. It was a tether, a lifeline, a boundary the abyss could not cross if observed. I had violated it, and for a moment, I had felt the true weight of exposure. I slumped against the console, sweat soaking my hair, lungs heaving. Every vibration in the walls, every flicker of light, reminded me that the abyss had noticed my mistake, measured my failure. I had survived, barely, but the rule was etched into my mind permanently. From that night onward, I never moved a single meter without logging it first. I understood now that the abyss watches constantly, measures every deviation, and responds. Without adherence, there is no safety, no escape, only the waiting dark. If ready, say. After narrowly surviving the outer dome and logging my location, I thought I understood all the threats the abyss could throw at me. But then I learned Rule 7, never respond to knocks on the hull at night, and it changed everything. At first, the rule sounded simple, almost laughable. Hulls are thick, and the sound of water currents or equipment settling can mimic knocks easily. Commander Hale made it a point to stress the rule during orientation. Do not acknowledge it. Do not investigate. Do not let curiosity tempt you. If you hear it, you pretend you don't. I nodded politely at the time, thinking it was to prevent panic among interns. But the first night I broke it, I realized the rule was a matter of life and death, and the abyss has a very patient sense of humor. I was in my bunk, lights off, drifting towards sleep after a long shift, checking the oxygen filtration system. The lab had been unusually quiet, the hum of life support and faint mechanical vibrations, my only companions. Then a soft knock echoed through the thick metal walls of the habitat. Tap, pause, tap, a slow, deliberate rhythm, measured, almost human. I froze. The sound came from the outer hull facing the trench's abyss, where no one had walked or existed for kilometers. My brain screamed at me. Rule 7. Never respond. Ignore it. Pretend it doesn't exist. Yet curiosity, or perhaps fear, drove me upright in bed, heart hammering, and toward the corridor leading to the observation deck. As I approached, each step magnified the echo of the knocks, though in reality, they were coming from outside, across meters of solid metal. The vibration in the floor beneath my boots felt different from ordinary currents. Deliberate, focused, alive. I gripped the railing of the corridor tightly, forcing myself to breathe normally. Shadows stretched along the walls, flickering in the emergency lighting, and I could feel the presence of something beyond the glass, something waiting for me. My mind whispered that it could be a diver, a sensor anomaly, even a hallucination, but deep inside I knew it wasn't any of those things. It was the abyss testing me, reminding me that some boundaries are absolute. The knocks came again, faster this time. Tap, 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 almost impatient. My hands shook as I reached the observation window. I could see nothing but the endless black of the trench, the familiar shimmer of bioluminescent plankton. But something was different. The plankton moved unnaturally, drifting toward one side, as if pushed by something immense hidden in the dark. I wanted to pull back, to retreat and obey the rule, but the knocking had a hypnotic quality, drawing me closer, testing my discipline. My pulse spiked. The shadows along the floor seemed to lean toward the window, like living extensions of whatever lurked outside. I whispered to myself, trying to convince my rational mind, repeating the rule silently. Never respond to knocks on the hull at night. I told myself to step away, to return to my bunk, to ignore the sound completely. But another tap, louder this time, reverberated through the metal. I flinched, my fingertips grazing the cold glass. The darkness outside seemed to respond, ripples, subtle at first, then widening, moving with impossible speed. A massive shape pressed briefly against the hull, a curve so large it defied logic, stretching beyond the viewable frame of the window. The knocks continued, faster now, insistent, as if urging me to open the hatch or lean against the glass, to acknowledge it. I stepped back, breathing ragged, trying to rationalize. Pressure shifts, equipment settling, hallucinations from exhaustion, all possible, none satisfactory. I remembered the stories, previous crews reporting strange tapping sounds, entire shifts lost, hulls sealed from the inside with no explanation. Commander Hale had said nothing could survive unrecorded in the lab, yet he didn't mention the hull entirely. The truth was worse. The abyss has patience measured in hours, days, months, and its experiments are deliberate. The knocking was testing me, probing for curiosity, measuring my obedience. And in that instant, I understood that breaking the rule would come with a price far worse than embarrassment or reprimand. Another tap, this time soft, almost intimate, followed by a whisper carried through the metal of the hull. I couldn't be sure if my ears were playing tricks, but it sounded like a voice I knew, one of the crew members, lost to the depths in prior months. "Come help," it breathed, distorted, slow, my gut twisted. Memories of Torres, of voices on the intercom that weren't human, surged through my mind. Panic overtook reason. I stumbled backward, away from the window, but the knocks didn't stop. Tap, tap, each one synchronized with the racing beat of my heart. Shadows writhed along the floor, flickering like something alive just beyond the light. I had broken the rule simply by looking, by acknowledging the sound internally, by imagining the presence outside. I ran toward the control room, hands fumbling with the emergency locks on the observation deck. Every instinct screamed to retreat, obey, hide. The knocking continued, but now felt behind me, not in front, as if the walls themselves carried the sound. I rounded the corner, lights flickering violently, the air thick with the metallic scent of fear, sweat, and something else I couldn't identify. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath fogged in front of me. The knocking grew erratic, shifting in tone, now almost mocking, as if aware of my attempted escape. I pressed against the steel wall, trembling violently, realizing I had underestimated the rule's importance. The abyss outside wasn't just knocking, it was watching, anticipating, learning. I tried calling over the intercom to Hale, to anyone, but only static replied, punctuated by faint tapping through the lab's internal network. It was impossible. Something had breached my perception of distance, of isolation. I could feel it measuring, tracking, following my heartbeat, my trembling fingers, the rhythm of my steps. I repeated the rule in my mind, desperate, never respond to knocks on the hull at night. But deep down, I knew that my mind had already responded. Acknowledgement was inevitable. Curiosity, fear, and instinct had combined, and the abyss had taken notice. Finally, I forced myself to return to my bunk, crawling along the corridor with my back to the observation window, eyes fixed on the floor. The knocking slowed, softened, then ceased entirely. For a moment, silence returned. My pulse continued to race, chest heaving. Shadows along the walls remained, subtle and writhing. I collapsed into my bed, shaking, unable to sleep, unable to ignore the fact that the abyss outside had made its presence undeniable. I realized, in that moment, that Rule 7 was not merely precautionary, it was a lifeline, a boundary set by knowledge that the abyss has patience, precision, and intent beyond human comprehension. Any acknowledgement, even mental, was dangerous. As I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, I could still feel the rhythm of tapping inside my skull, faint, insistent, like an echo of what the hull had whispered. My heartbeat synced with it. The abyss had tested me, and I had survived, but only by retreating and remembering the rule. I knew now that the dark outside Lab 9 isn't empty. It waits, it observes, and it remembers every lapse in obedience. Rule 7 isn't a suggestion. It is a survival mechanism, as absolute as the crushing pressure outside, as constant as the cold black water pressing against the glass. And even now, hours later, I can still feel the faint vibrations of those knocks through the floor, a lingering reminder that the abyss never forgets. After the terrifying ordeal with the hall, I thought I had seen the limits of what the abyss could throw at me. But Rule 8, never look directly at the bioluminescent shadows, proved to be a test unlike any other. At first, the warning sounded almost poetic, absurd even, as though someone had romanticized the danger of shadows glowing in the blackness outside the lab. I remembered Hale's stern face during briefing, voice low and urgent. Do not make eye contact. The shadows respond. They imitate. They follow. They learn. I thought I understood what he meant, until the night I made the mistake, leaning too far into the observation deck, unable to tear my eyes away from the flickering lights beyond the thick reinforced glass. It began subtly, bioluminescence, faint and scattered, drifting across the trench outside the lab. At first, I thought it was normal, plankton, the natural deep-sea life glowing faintly in the darkness. But then the shapes started moving differently, coordinated, almost like they were communicating. They seemed to stretch and bend, elongating and twisting in ways that defied the ocean currents. I remembered Rule 8, whispered in my mind, never look directly at the bioluminescent shadows. But my curiosity, mingled with lingering fear from the hull incident, made my eyes linger. And in that moment, the abyss took notice. The shadows began to respond directly to my gaze. When I looked left, a figure drifted left. When I blinked, it blinked. It was as though my very focus animated them, gave them life beyond the natural motion of currents. I stumbled backward along the observation deck, heart hammering, hands pressed against the reinforced glass. The shapes swirled faster now, forming vague humanoid outlines that twisted and warped, impossibly long and thin, with no discernible faces. My breath fogged the window, and I had to remind myself that they weren't human. But the effect of making eye contact was immediate and horrifying. They began to mimic my every movement, a grotesque reflection of my panic. I stumbled toward the emergency console, trying to shut down the observation lights, in hopes that darkness would break their hold. My fingers trembled as I keyed the controls. The shadows outside seemed unaffected, growing brighter in response to the dimming interior, like a predator feeding off my panic. My mind raced. If I left the shadows unchecked, they could extend their presence further into the lab, into areas where humans could not retreat. I reminded myself again, silently, of Rule 8, never look directly at the bioluminescent shadows. It wasn't just a precaution, it was the only way to avoid giving them awareness, to avoid marking myself as a target. Suddenly, one of the shapes pressed against the glass in a grotesque mimicry of my body. It leaned, extended an arm, as though trying to touch me through the barrier. I staggered back, tripping over a loose cable on the deck. My flashlight fell, casting erratic beams across the walls. The shadows outside reacted instantly, coalescing, forming a mass larger than the viewport itself, pulsating, glowing brighter with every flash of light. I forced my shaking hands to cover my eyes, but the glow seeped into my vision through every crack, every reflection. My pulse thumped violently. I realized the shadows didn't need me to look directly forever. They only needed a glimpse to track me, to learn the angles of my panic. I retreated toward the hall leading to the inner lab modules, but the shadows began to extend their influence along the walls. Light sensors flickered, automated blinds moved, reflections danced across every reflective surface in the corridor. It was disorienting. The air seemed thicker, heavier, each step more labored than the last. The shapes outside were still visible in fragments, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. I forced myself to stop looking, lowering my gaze toward the floor and gripping the railing. My thoughts spun with dread. Rule 8 existed for a reason. Breaking it even momentarily could cost me everything. My mind raced back to the stories of previous crews who had fallen victim to the abyss, shadows that followed, shapes that learned, and people lost to the deep never returned. I felt a creeping certainty. They remembered me now. They knew me. I was marked. The soft pulse of bioluminescence seemed to vibrate through the walls, reverberating inside my skull. Every reflection of light from my hands or helmet made the shapes shift, reposition, inch closer. The corridor ahead felt endless, a labyrinth designed by the abyss to trap attention, to exploit human curiosity. My instincts screamed to run, yet my feet moved sluggishly, weighed down by fear and the oppressive hum of the lab's life support. Then, the first voice reached my ears, soft, almost melodic, carried by the vibrations in the walls, not human, not mechanical. It called my name, or something close enough to trigger recognition, weaving through the metal ducts. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound persisted, vibrating through the reinforced floors. The shadows outside seemed to pulse in synchrony with it, glowing brighter with every flicker of the hallucination. Or was it real? My chest tightened. Each step I took brought new grotesque shapes into view, stretching impossibly, twisting into forms I could barely comprehend. They were learning, responding, adjusting to my movements, guided entirely by my gaze and attention. I realized then that Rule 8 was not a warning. It was a boundary. It was a boundary. It was a command that ensured survival by denying the abyss access to awareness. I had broken it, just for a fleeting moment. I had looked directly at the shadows, and now they knew me, understood my movements, anticipated my reactions. My flashlight, still clutched in trembling hands, was useless against the pressure of the dark outside. I backed into a corner, sliding against the metal wall, trying to calm my breathing, to slow the pulse of my heartbeat, to deny them the synchronization they craved. The shadows moved again, shifting along the viewport, stretching into grotesque mimics of the lab's interior. Reflections from monitors and control panels created illusions of depth and motion, amplifying my disorientation. I could hear faint hissing, like breath over the glass, synchronized with the low hum of the habitat systems. My fingers ached from gripping the railing too tightly. The urge to look again, to confirm what I saw, was almost unbearable, a magnet pulling my eyes back to the glowing forms. But I forced my gaze downward, reciting the rule in my mind over and over. Never look directly at the bioluminescent shadows. Each repetition was a lifeline, a tether to sanity and survival. Minutes, or was it hours, passed. The glow faded slightly, the pulse in the walls slowing. I stayed crouched, eyes fixed on the floor, counting breaths, willing myself not to glance at the window. The shadows seemed to retreat, but I knew better. They were patient, they were learning. One misstep, one flicker of attention, and they would return, more confident, more aware. I understood now that Rule 8 was not just a guideline, it was a survival mechanism, a way to deny the abyss the information it needed to hunt, to manipulate, to extend its reach into the lab and ultimately into human minds. Exhausted, I finally moved toward the inner lab modules, still avoiding any glance at the viewport. Every reflective surface threatened a glimpse of the bioluminescent forms, every shimmer of light a reminder that they had been aware of me. I pressed the emergency button to seal the observation deck behind me, my heartbeat still synchronized with the residual glow outside. I had survived, but barely. Rule 8 was now engraved in my consciousness, a permanent boundary, and in the depths beyond Lab 9, I knew the shadows waited, patient, luminous, and aware. After surviving the bioluminescent shadows, I thought the rules were simply precautions. But Rule 9, never trust the automated lights alone, proved that the abyss could manipulate even the systems designed to keep us safe. The lab's automated lighting system was meant to maintain constant illumination, adjusted for shifts, energy consumption, and emergency scenarios. It had always been reliable, glowing softly when needed, flickering slightly only when maintenance was required. But after my previous encounters, I began noticing small irregularities, lights dimming just before a system alert, flickers appearing where no maintenance logs indicated. Hale had always stressed the rule during orientation, emphasizing that our own senses, not the lab's automation, were the only true indicators of safety. I thought I understood what he meant, until I realized the lights could lie, and the abyss could manipulate them. That evening, after hours of exhausting shifts monitoring pressure differentials, I walked down the central corridor toward the storage bay. The lights flickered slightly, something I initially dismissed as a power surge. But as I continued, I noticed shadows stretching in unnatural directions, elongated by angles that shouldn't have existed in the consistent illumination. A soft hum filled the air above me, synchronized with the flickering lights, vibrating through the walls. I paused, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The rule came back to me sharply: never trust the automated lights alone. I understood then that the lights could deceive, could bend reality in subtle ways, and the abyss could exploit that deception to draw attention, to isolate, and to terrify. The corridor ahead appeared longer than it should have, the lights flickering in patterns that didn't correspond to my movement. Every shadowed corner seemed exaggerated, amplified by the automation's subtle manipulation. My flashlight, clutched in shaking hands, cast its own wavering glow, but the automated lights seemed to twist around it, creating overlapping darkness that moved independently. The air felt heavy, each breath a reminder of my vulnerability. I realized the abyss was using the lights as a weapon, altering perception, exaggerating movement, creating the illusion of shapes that didn't exist. Or were they real? My pulse raced, and every step felt slower, as if the corridor itself resisted my progress. I reached the storage bay, intended to check supplies and confirm the pressure seals. The automated lights were dimmer here, flickering rapidly, casting fragmented beams that made the storage crates appear stacked impossibly high, teetering in impossible angles. I reminded myself of Rule 9 silently: never trust the automated lights alone. My eyes darted, trying to rely on my own senses, rather than the lab's deceptive illumination. Each flicker felt deliberate, as if the abyss itself were guiding the system to distort reality, to make me doubt my own perception. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting across the floor and walls, forming vague humanoid shapes that appeared and disappeared with the rhythm of the faulty lights. I moved carefully, flashlight steady, focusing on the floor, avoiding the illusions. But then, a movement caught my attention from the far corner of the storage bay. The automated lights flickered off entirely, leaving me in near-total darkness. My heart raced. I could hear faint shuffling, soft and deliberate, almost human, but slower, more calculated. I crouched, flashlight aimed toward the sound. A shadow seemed to stretch along the walls, elongating unnaturally, moving faster than any human could in the confined space. The lights returned briefly, then flickered again, revealing nothing, only the distorted shadows cast across crates and conduits. My mind reeled. The rule wasn't a suggestion, it was essential, a line between sanity and becoming prey. I pressed toward the far wall to locate the emergency lighting override. Each step sent a shiver through the metal flooring. The shadows outside the beam of my flashlight seemed to converge subtly, as though aware of my focus. A low vibration ran through the floor, echoing through the storage bay, synchronized with the erratic flicker of the automated lights. I froze. The darkness felt alive, stretching, expanding. My breathing came in shallow gasps. I remembered Hale's warning during the briefing: automated lights can't be trusted in isolation. They can lie, exaggerate, and manipulate perception. But now, facing the reality of distorted shadows and flickering illumination, I understood fully what he meant. A sudden sharp flicker revealed a shape crouched atop one of the crates. Tall, humanoid, but impossibly thin, with arms that extended beyond normal proportions. The figure vanished the instant the lights stuttered again, leaving nothing but the distorted reflection of crates in the emergency lighting panels. I forced myself to breathe, repeating Rule 9 in my mind, trying to trust my senses over the flawed lights. Never trust the automated lights alone. My flashlight beam swept carefully, revealing nothing tangible, yet I could feel its presence, close, patient, waiting for a misstep. Each flicker of the automated lights was a test, a subtle manipulation of my fear, an extension of the abyss into the lab's interior. The storage bay seemed endless now, corridors bending in impossible directions. Automated lights dimmed and brightened, unpredictably, casting shadows that moved independently of any physical source. I felt eyes on me, though I could see nothing. The lights, my previous beacon of guidance, were now unreliable narrators, distorting my perception, amplifying every sound, every vibration. I reminded myself again of Rule 9, grounding myself in reality, through thought alone. The abyss had learned to exploit every system we trusted, turning them into extensions of its will, warping the environment, manipulating instinct, testing obedience. I reached the override console, trembling, fingers flying across controls to activate full emergency lighting. The flickers ceased, replaced by a steady, harsh illumination. The shadows outside the window retreated slightly, coalescing into vague forms, no longer interacting with the light in the same unnatural way. My chest heaved, limbs trembling, mind racing. I understood the abyss had been probing my perception, learning how I relied on technology, manipulating systems to distort reality and measure my reaction. Rule 9 had saved me from an immediate confrontation with something far beyond human comprehension, reminding me that reliance on automation could be fatal. Exhausted and shaken, I backed toward the inner lab modules, flashlight now redundant, with the emergency lighting steady. Shadows still lingered at the periphery, a reminder that the abyss's influence extended beyond the visible, manipulating fear and perception with every subtle flicker. Rule 9 was clear: trust your own senses, not systems designed to protect you. The abyss had exploited my previous reliance, demonstrating its patience and intelligence. I vowed to never again allow the automated lights to guide me alone, to always question, always observe, and always trust my instincts over the technology that could betray me at a moment's notice. I settled near the control module, still shaken, flashlight in hand, heartbeat finally slowing, yet aware that the abyss was patient, waiting, learning. Rule 9, never trust the automated lights alone, was now fully internalized. The distorted flickers, the shadow shapes, and the manipulations of perception had proven that even the most trusted systems could become instruments of terror when the abyss had influence. I knew that the coming days would test me further, each rule escalating in danger, and that survival required strict obedience, attention, and a careful balance between trust and vigilance. I didn't understand the true weight of Rule 10. If you hear breathing in the vents, don't breathe back until the night the circulation system began acting like a living organism. The vents were designed to push clean, filtered oxygen throughout the underwater facility, cycling air through layers of pressurization units and thermal regulators. They were loud, mechanical, predictable. But the sound I heard that night was nothing like machinery. It wasn't the rhythmic hum of fans or the rush of airflow. It was slow, deliberate, too organic, like someone exhaling directly into the metal ducts, patient and waiting. Hearing it made every instinct inside me freeze, reminding me that down here beneath 7 miles of crushing darkness, even the air wasn't ours alone. It happened during a routine systems check after the incident with the automated lights. I was already sleep-deprived, nerves frayed, constantly on edge. The lab had felt wrong since the distortion event. Pressure too heavy, lights too steady, silence too watchful. But the vents were what kept us alive, so I stayed late, monitoring the airflow diagnostics. The lights hummed overhead, steady thanks to the emergency override, but the stillness made the faintest sounds unmistakable. It started as a distant thud somewhere deep in the ventilation tunnels, subtle enough that I assumed it was thermal shift in the metal. But then came the breathing. Long, slow, heavy exhalations that echoed through the ducts as if something enormous was lying just beyond the grates. I froze at my console, listening. The breathing grew clearer, louder, almost purposeful. Each exhale vibrated through the tiny screws in the vent, covers along the walls, shaking the metal ever so slightly. My own breath caught in my throat, and I remembered Hale's voice from orientation, his calm, steady tone breaking only once as he delivered Rule 10. "If you hear breathing in the vents," he'd said, eyes tense, "don't breathe back. Don't let it know you're there." I hadn't understood what he meant then. How could something inside the ventilation system care if we breathed? But now, hearing that slow, deliberate exhale filling the ducts, I understood breathing back meant responding, engaging, acknowledging. I held my breath instinctively. My lungs ached almost immediately, but I didn't dare inhale. The breathing in the vents grew heavier, almost curious, as if realizing something inside the room had changed. The airflow monitors flickered, readings spiking in impossible directions. Pressure fluctuations rippled through the ducts, shaking the paneling slightly. I stepped back from the console slowly, terrified that any movement might make the breathing shift. The vent above my head rattled, just once, subtle but unmistakable. Something was moving inside, something large. I forced myself to stay silent, every muscle trembling with the effort of holding my breath. The breathing from the vents grew closer, sliding through the metal pipes, airless, hungry. It felt wrong in a way I struggled to describe, as though the sound wasn't just traveling but searching. The vent's shadow stretched across the floor like an opening mouth. I backed away until my shoulders hit the wall. My lungs burned for oxygen, but I couldn't breathe. Not yet, not while that thing was listening. The breathing stopped suddenly. The silence was immediate and crushing, as though the entire facility were waiting with me. My chest spasmed with the need for air. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3, and then I broke, inhaling sharply despite myself. The metal vent above me slammed loudly from the inside, as if something had thrown its weight against it the moment I breathed. The screws rattled violently. The vent cover bulged outward, bending slightly under pressure. My heart lurched into my throat. I staggered backward, gasping, eyes locked on the trembling vent. Whatever was inside had sensed my breath instantly, like a predator alerted to movement. The breathing resumed, now louder, faster, mimicking the rhythm of my own panicked inhales. Each exhale it produced was suffocatingly heavy, thick, almost wet. The airflow readings on the console spiked into red alert. The ducts groaned, expanding and contracting as though lungs were forming inside them. I forced myself to crouch behind the console, covering my mouth with both hands, inhaling as shallowly as possible. The breathing in the vents slowed again, returning to long, patient exhales. My spine felt like it was turning to ice. It wasn't just reacting, it was learning, mimicking, waiting. Rule 10 wasn't a warning about breathing too loudly. It was a warning about something in the vents that wanted you to respond. Something that fed on reaction, recognition, or perhaps the simple confirmation that you were alive. A soft metallic scrape echoed down the duct, like nails dragging along steel. The sound traveled from vent to vent, circling the room. I stayed crouched, silent, barely breathing. The scraping moved past me, then paused at the vent nearest the floor. The slats darkened, as though something were blocking the airflow from behind. A low guttural inhale rattled through the metal. I could feel its breath, cold and unnatural, slipping through the gaps in the vent cover. I squeezed my eyes shut. "Don't breathe back. Don't breathe back. Don't." A sudden clang jolted me. The vent cover nearest the door bulged outward violently, then snapped back into place. The thing inside the ducts was moving rapidly now, crawling through the ventilation system with impossible speed. I heard metal bending, ducts groaning, something huge rushing through the network of pipes above the ceiling. It moved past engineering, past storage, past medical. Every vent it passed shuddered violently, as though being dragged along by claws or limbs far too long for human anatomy. Then silence, no breathing, no scraping, no vibration, just a stillness so deep it felt alive. I waited. Seconds passed, then minutes. My heart hammered so loudly it echoed in my ears. I didn't dare stand, didn't dare breathe deeply. The vents remained dark, silent, motionless. I slowly, carefully eased out from behind the console, keeping my eyes locked on every vent cover in sight. When I finally allowed myself a full breath, the airflow returned to normal, steady, mechanical, harmless. The diagnostics stabilized. Everything appeared calm again. The system behaved as if nothing had happened, but I knew something had, and it wasn't gone. The breathing wasn't mechanical failure. It wasn't pressure shift. It wasn't hallucination. Something was inside the ventilation system, something intelligent, patient, and hungry. And for the first time since arriving at the facility, I understood why Hale looked broken when he first taught me Rule 10. Because whatever was in the vents had learned his breath too, and now it had learned mine. I reached for the comms to report the incident, but the vent above the console let out a slow, deliberate exhale, right behind me. I never understood the terror buried inside Rule 11. If you wake up in a room with no doors, don't assume you're alone until the moment I opened my eyes and felt the wrongness of the air pressing against my skin. My back was resting on smooth metal again, but this surface was different, warmer, as though someone had been lying there before me. The lighting was dim, a dull blue glow like the early hours of the lab before sunrise, but softer, almost diffused. I pushed myself up slowly, expecting to see the familiar outlines of the research bay, or at least one of the narrow hallways. Instead, I found myself in a perfectly square room. No windows, no panels, no vents, no seams, just walls that curved ever so slightly inward, as if the room were designed to hold something, or someone. My first instinct was to check the floor for markings, tools, or anything that looked like lab equipment. But the room was empty, bare metal, silent, unmoving. A kind of silence so complete that it felt like sound had been erased entirely. I stood slowly, my legs trembling from the combination of fear and the strain of constant adrenaline. Every inch of the room felt wrong, not because of anything visible, but because of what I couldn't see. The walls had no shadows, no texture, no signs of construction. They looked poured, grown, or shaped by something that didn't care for human design. And the air, it was warm, too warm, like someone was breathing near me, even though there was nowhere for anyone to be. I tried calling out softly, testing the acoustics. My voice didn't echo, it didn't bounce. It simply vanished, as if the room swallowed it. I rubbed my arms, trying to calm the rising panic. The last thing I remembered was the vent behind me exhaling, cold and deliberate, and then darkness swallowing me before I could react. Had I been dragged here, carried, or had the waking event pulled me into another fabricated environment? My heart hammered as I tried to control my breathing. The air felt too thick, too close, almost like standing in a small space with another living body. Yet the room was empty, at least visibly empty. I stepped cautiously toward one of the walls, pressing my hand against it. The surface pulsed faintly beneath my palm, not with heat but with pressure, like something shifting just beneath the metal. I jerked my hand back, stumbling a step. My brain fought the explanation, but another part of me understood instantly. The walls weren't walls. They were something else masquerading as structure. Something that could move if it wanted to. I backed up quickly, positioning myself in the middle of the room. My breathing grew shallow. A faint vibration traveled through the floor, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I turned slowly, scanning every inch of the room again, searching for seams or openings. Nothing. No hatch, no door, no vent, nothing that made sense. Okay, I whispered to myself, though the sound died instantly. Think. The room's temperature shifted again, rising by a few degrees. My skin prickled. A wave of heat rolled across my back, subtle but noticeable, as though someone were standing right behind me. I spun around, fists clenched, expecting to see something towering over me. But the room remained empty. The heat lingered, then slowly receded, drifting toward the wall in front of me, before fading. Something was in here with me, not seen, not heard, but undeniably present. I crouched, inspecting the floor more closely. The metal had shallow indentations, not scratches, not marks, but slight depressions, too smooth to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. They reminded me of impressions left by something resting its weight, something heavy, something that didn't need doors. My pulse thudded unevenly. The warmth returned, this time brushing past my left side like a hand dragging through water. I flinched, stepping backward instinctively. My heel hit the wall behind me, but instead of cold metal, I felt a slow shift under the surface, like muscle tensing beneath skin. I sprang forward, stumbling to the center of the room. Panic surged through me. "You're not alone," Hale had once whispered after too many sleepless nights, his eyes hollow. "The room tests whether you understand that." I never asked him what he meant. I never wanted to. But standing here now, with invisible warmth circling me like a predator feeling out its prey, I understood the truth he'd been too shaken to articulate. The waking spaces weren't just relocation events, they were interactions, attempts. Something in the deep wanted to see how we responded when trapped with it. The warmth shifted again, gliding behind me. I turned slowly, trying not to appear frantic. A faint distortion rippled across the floor, barely visible but unmistakably real, like a heat shimmer, taking shape. It paused when I froze, hovering a few feet away. The air thickened, pushing against my lungs. I swallowed hard, staring at the distortion as it subtly pulsed. It wasn't growing or shrinking, it was breathing. I took a cautious step backward. The distortion followed, maintaining the same distance. My breath caught in my throat. Another step. It mirrored me. I lifted my hand slowly. The distortion twitched, shifting across the floor like liquid thought. Every movement I made, it understood, adapted to, reacted to. I lowered my hand. It settled. My mind raced through panic and strategy. If it reacted to stimulus, I could manipulate that, or provoke it, or confuse it. But if it was intelligent, as everything in this place suggested, it might simply be allowing me to think I had control. The room dimmed suddenly, the blue lighting flickering into deeper tones. The distortion expanded, lifting slightly off the floor until it hovered at waist height. The air grew hot, suffocating, pushing into my throat like invisible fingers. I staggered sideways, and the distortion surged forward, stopping only inches from my chest. Heat radiated from it intensely now, not like warmth but like breath, hot, invasive, probing. I held completely still. The distortion hovered, pulsing softly, as if evaluating me. Seconds passed in excruciating silence. Then the room pulsed, not visually, physically. A deep, slow pressure wave traveled through the walls and floor, vibrating through my bones. The distortion responded instantly, flattening against the floor like a shadow being pressed down. Then it began spreading, thin tendrils of heat crawling along the metal toward every corner of the room. I took another cautious step back. The tendrils paused, then reversed direction, converging toward the center where I stood. It wasn't reacting anymore, it was approaching. I circled the room's center, keeping my steps slow and measured. The tendrils followed lazily, as if confident. My heart pounded, panic surging with each movement. I needed an escape, a distraction, something. But the room had nothing to offer. No tools, no vents, no weaknesses, only smooth metal, and the pulsing presence sharing it with me. The distortion reached the center, pulling itself together into a single shape once more. It rose, higher this time, forming a faint outline vaguely human in height but not in form. Heat swept over my face. I backed up until my shoulders touched the wall. The shape drifted forward, measuring, sensing, tasting the space between us. It didn't have eyes, but I felt watched, intimately, invasively, like it was reading my pulse, my breathing, my fear. The room tightened, pressure building until my ears rang. The shape leaned closer. The air thickened, my vision blurred. Then I blinked, and I was standing somewhere else. Another room, another waking space. Only this one had a door. a door standing slightly open, and something breathing just behind it. I wasn't sure whether I'd escaped the entity in the doorless room, or whether it had followed me here. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.